the interview of Gareth. Thank you, Cassandra.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
So, Gareth,
Yes.
bye-bye. How are you, Gareth?
Sorry about the technical difficulties there. I'm not.
No, that's we're doing the best we can. We're fortunate to have this technology at all to have people around the world watching in live. Gareth, I wanted to carry on with the conversation, and I thank you for joining us. Tell me, in what instances and stories that you've written that you drew directly on WikiLeaks documents? Can you recall?
Yeah, of course. This is a very important point because I was part of this volume that I mentioned in the interview, very short interview that we just had. The volume that was edited by Assange, and which included essays drawn from the WikiLeaks documents, and on I think there are probably 15 chapters without having actually counted them. I'm guessing there are 15 chapters on different countries and cross-country issues that were written by authors who, of course, had an arrangement with WikiLeaks to look at the documents and to pick out the documents that they felt were most important on the issue that they were focusing on, they were concentrating on. And I had the essay on Iran, on U.S. relations with Iran, and was able to pull together from the WikiLeaks documents a very important array of documents that added up to a very important case that showed how the United States had basically misrepresented, well, the U.S. Well, first of all, U.S. media misrepresented what was going on with regard to Iran-related issues. And particularly, I showed the New York Times in my essay based on the WikiLeaks documents. I showed that the New York Times had fundamentally represented a whole series of documents on the Iran part of the WikiLeaks documents. And I don't know if you want to go into detail about that. I think it's probably not the place to do that. But what I found was that these documents told a story, in short, about how the United States had carried out a conference with Russian specialists on Iran's program of the space program, not space program, but their long-range missile program. And what I found was that the New York Times had fundamentally misrepresented a whole series of documents, and that I, in fact, wrote a couple of pieces which showed how fundamentally the Times had misrepresented those WikiLeaks documents. So my point is that the WikiLeaks documents really did provide a window on the truth about what had happened with regard to the United States and Iran, which then the New York Times proceeded to completely misrepresent in their own coverage.
Where can people find that essay you wrote, Gary?
This is in a book called The WikiLeaks Files.
Uh-huh.
The WikiLeaks Files was published in, I have to check myself to refresh my memory. Introduction was by Julian Assange, and it's published by Verso in 2013. The first publication, publishing was 2015, excuse me. So this is a very valuable source for how the WikiLeaks documents were used by scholars and journalists to basically set the record straight on a whole range of very important issues relating to U.S. policy in particular.
Of course, we also learned that famous line from a Saudi cable about cutting the head of the snake, meaning going after Iran. That came from WikiLeaks as well. Let's go back, if we can, to the we, of course, got the Pentagon Papers from Daniel Ellsberg, but that took quite a while to put together for him to get it actually leaked to the press, and the war had been going on a long time. Had WikiLeaks existed back then, and if Dan Ellsberg had access to give these documents to someone like Julian Assange back then, and they could have been put out on the internet, what impact might that have had on the anti-war protests and on the course of the war itself? It's pure speculation. It's a what-if question, but I'm curious what you think.
No, it's a very interesting question, and I've thought about a similar question myself, Joe. And in fact, I wrote an essay about this parallel between the Pentagon Papers on one hand and the WikiLeaks files on the other hand. And what I decided after considering those two episodes, historical episodes, is that probably the same thing would have happened simply because the press in this country is so, I mean, actually the same thing did in a way happen, because I've spoken with Dan Ellsberg about this very issue. And Dan was and is convinced that the Pentagon Papers were misreported by the New York Times and by others, that the message that he had hoped would come through from the Pentagon Papers really didn't come through. It was very circumscribed, if at all reflected in the New York Times coverage of the Pentagon Papers and the other major media coverage of the Pentagon Papers. And instead they sensationalized it and didn't convey fully the significance of what Dan Ellsberg, and I would agree with him, were the essential lessons to be learned from the Pentagon Papers. So I think it's the case that had we had the WikiLeaks files, before the internet came about, and there was some way to make them public, that much the same thing would have happened at that point as well.
You mean the press would have misinterpreted?
The press would have misinterpreted. And of course, that is exactly what has happened.
Well, see, this is a really important point you're raising, because then, of course, Senator Mike Gravel, who I wrote a book with about this, as a friend of mine, did eventually publish the entire 4 volumes of the Pentagon Papers by Beacon Press, but that was in 1972. So these papers were written in the mid-60s, and it took several years later for the public to have access to the entire documents for them to read. Now, this is what WikiLeaks does, of course. It puts out the entire documents. But then the public still depends on journalists to write stories about them. Now, did you see that same type of misinterpretation by the press of, let's say, the Afghan cables or the Iraq, the collateral damage cables, or the State Department cables, or the ones you were talking about Iran? Did you also see big media also misinterpreting a lot of what WikiLeaks put out?
Well, I know that it was the case with regard to Iraq, because I did do some of the work myself on writing about some of the cables relating to Iraq, and I found that that the media coverage on that was quite far from the mark. In other words, they gave it a very different twist from what the cables themselves showed. And in some cases, it was really quite blatant. So I think that absolutely there's a parallel there between the case that I was citing originally, that is the Iran-focused cables, and cables that have to do with Iraq and Afghanistan as well. I think that it's a generalized problem.
But activists and ordinary citizens and alternative journalists can go to the documents themselves and draw their own conclusions and write their own stories that will be different than the New York Times or the Washington Post would write. That would have happened perhaps back in the Vietnam days as well. In other words, had the Pentagon Papers, the entire 4 volumes of those papers, been put out on an internet, and if there had been an internet, would that have had a quicker impact on the anti-war movement? would it have had because the anti-war movement gradually developed, of course, and after Tet, it became stronger, the Tet offensive, but it took a long time really to start up. There were some people early on, and I think you might have been one of them, who were opposed to the war, but only a couple of people in Congress were at the very beginning. It wasn't and the media was totally on board in favor of the war, including Walter Cronkite, who gets a lot of credit for being against the war. He was pro-war. And it was only when the public and the demonstrations began that pushed the media, I think, to be more critical of the war. So I'm saying if the entire tranche was put out there of the entire Pentagon Papers earlier, would that have at least impacted people on the ground? Forget about the media's interpretation of that. Would that have had a more direct impact on the anti-war movement?
Well, I hadn't thought of it from that point of view. I was thinking more in terms of the institutions that existed at that time. And from that point of view, it seems to me the differences between institutions in the 1960s and alternative institutions in particular in our present era are so stark that I'm inclined to think that it would have been difficult to get the kind of coverage, except for I.F. Stone,
yeah.
in the 60s and early 70s that you're talking about. I tend to think that we have gone through so many years, so many events, and so much change in consciousness since then that the differences are really quite stark.
But I'm not even talking about media so much as anti-war demonstrators reading the documents directly without a filter of any kind of journalist, and then speaking amongst themselves about it and organizing around the information.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess if you had a means of publication that was widely distributed enough, then perhaps that could have happened. Yes.
Yeah. In other words, have the instant Pentagon Papers the way we have instant WikiLeaks documents, rather than having to be published in a book several years later. It could have been out there immediately.
That wasn't the case. So, it is in our minds rather than in reality.
Yeah. And then why isn't that happening today? Because we do have the WikiLeaks documents, and it's not leading to a revival of anti-war movements, is it?
Well, in the sense of the anti-war movement that we're all familiar with, you're absolutely right. There is something else happening which is important, absolutely, and to understand the difference between those two things and how they not interact, but how they are related to one another, is important at this point. And I would not dismiss the ways in which the online publications such as Consortium News and others can in fact have an effect. And I think we're still in the process of seeing that effect become enlarged. So I think we all can have some hope that change is still in the process of happening in this regard. And so I take your point that there is a process by which this kind of information is getting out. It's reaching more and more people all the time. That change is happening, I think, with some rapidity.
So let me ask you a two-pronged question here about the way the corporate media is now treating Julian Assange. When he came out with these documents that were critical of the Bush administration in in Afghanistan and Iraq, I mean, the New York Times ran front-page stories. The Washington Post did. There was media all over the world the Guardian, and that partnered with WikiLeaks, and they couldn't deny that this was news. I mean, they had, whether these were stolen documents, they were classified, but they had possession of them. They published them. Now we're seeing the corporate media totally turning on Julian Assange. And I think it had to do with the 2016 election. There's a partisan dimension to this. Suddenly he is not a hero for them anymore, or a worthy source. He is somehow a villain. He was someone who had given them enormous amount of important scoops, and now they've turned their back on him directly. I want to know why you think that. And the second part of the question is, what is the impact on corporate media themselves if something should happen to Julian Assange in terms of his prosecution? Because there was the number 2 legal counsel of the New York Times spoke a couple of months ago out on the West Coast to a bunch of judges. In a speech, he said that we're in trouble if Julian Assange is arrested. Because they come after, that ends the protections that the media has had about publishing classified information, because what he has done, we do as well. the same thing very often. We publish classified information. So those are the two questions I was wondering if you might address.
With regard to the impact of the of this kind of revelation under the present circumstances, yeah, I think you're right that this is the one Achilles heel of the media, that they understand. Certainly, the people who are concerned with the legal aspects of this understand that there are dangers here in the pursuit of Julian Assange. And that's important to know. The other side of the picture, of course, however, is the other point that you made, that by the time of the 2016 election, Assange had become persona non grata with corporate media because they were obviously on the other side by that time. They had learned that that he was dangerous to them to be associated with Julian Assange, even though they had published the stuff that came from Assange, and in that sense should in fact be lining up behind it, absolutely. But politically, that was no longer feasible, or it was no longer wise, shall we say, from their point of view. So I think you have a very mixed situation for the corporate media. They understand that there are dangers ahead if, in fact, the people who want to get a hold of Assange and subject him to the law in the United States. On the other hand, politically, this is very difficult for them. So I don't know exactly how that plays out. I'd be interested in your view on that as well. Just to return the question.
But I think this is a very good example of the absolute poison of partisanship that has taken over the United States in a way that I don't think I've ever seen before. You had, again, the New York Times and the big media with open arms accepted what WikiLeaks had given them because it revealed crimes by the Bush administration, particularly in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Suddenly, he releases documents that are absolutely correct and accurate about how the Democratic Party, manipulated that primary process and other unsavory things we learned about Hillary Clinton, her speeches to Wall Street, etc., which again were absolutely true, and it helped inform voters about her, and may or may not have heard her. Absolutely, probably heard her, but we don't know if it was a determined factor in the election. And suddenly, he's become someone that has to be hunted down and arrested and brought to the United States to stand trial. And the press is not resisting what we hear from Mike Pompeo when he was CIA director about Julian being somehow.
Not only they're not resisting, they are absolutely part of the hunting party against, after his scalp. They are at the very center of it, as far as I'm concerned.
Now, I don't recall, maybe you do, how Fox News covered the first parts of WikiLeaks about Iraq and Afghanistan, when it was detrimental to the Bush administration. I don't know whether they condemned him, whether they published the stories. I don't know if you recall that. But now they love him.
Yeah. Of course, I think they downplayed it at the very least. I mean, I think we can safely say that.
Yeah.
At that point, yes.
But now he's great, and even Trump famously has said he loves WikiLeaks.
Yes.
So, and this proves to me why Julian Assange is nonpartisan.
Yes.
He's not, because he's done, but he's revealed secrets about both sides that have made them look very bad. And this is what he's always said and what he does. And the idea that he is somehow the enemy of Clinton or the ally of Trump is ridiculous, because he had been the so-called enemy of George Bush. I don't think he's an enemy of an ally of anyone. WikiLeaks is trying to get classified information that helps reveal the dark side of our governments and what they do and why they do it. And this is the unending value of WikiLeaks. But when you have the partisan reaction to this is just so obvious that it's kind of terrifying.
Yeah, right. And this underlines the absolute importance of creating a nonpartisan movement that is after the truth and therefore in support of Julian Assange.
And that's what Unity for J is, by the way. And it's been attacked by numerous people for being for taking people from different political stripes to come on this online vigil and speak in defense of WikiLeaks and what it does. And that's very troubling. Abby Martin being one of them, apparently, and Justin Radick, another. They have gone on to attack the Unity for J movement because we have Cassandra Fairbanks on, who was just on talking to you, who is in Rights for Right-Wing Media, as she told us, and we have you on, and I'm from Consortium News, and we are nonpartisan, and I've been attacked from both sides now because when Consortium News questions Russiagate, we're accused of being Russian dupes and Kremlin puppets and pro-Trump. And recently we ran a couple articles very critical of Kavanaugh, and now we are Democrats. So it's very hard to operate in this environment, Gareth. I don't know what you think.
No doubt about that, and you can feel assured that you're on the right track without any question.
Well, if you're making enemies on both sides, you're probably doing the right thing, and that goes for Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
He's made enemies on all sides.
Yes.
That's why you need supporters on all sides.
Yes, and in fact, there are supporters that are at least drawn from what were traditionally considered to be right, left, and center. So I think that he's, in that regard, absolutely on the right track.
Now, what do you think the consequences would be if he were to leave the embassy because Ecuador decides to kick him out? He's arrested. He is extradited. I think that sealed indictment is somewhere near where we are both right now, somewhere in Northern Virginia, maybe here in Alexandria, and he could come to a courtroom very close to us. What would you think happen? Is there any chance he can get a fair trial? Would they use state secrets privilege? What would the consequences be if he were to be prosecuted?
Well, I think you've probably answered your own question, as you often do, in the sense that you ask questions that are so well informed that they imply the answer. And I think that definitely, if given the opportunity, this administration would tend to use the tools that that are available to it to try to prosecute. But at the same time, there would be a lot of politics surrounding this, and it'd be more complicated for obvious reasons, for the reasons that you've already outlined in your earlier remarks. So this is an extremely complex moment politically in terms of the Trump administration and the question of what to do about Assange. But I certainly do fear that the present administration, the present government in Ecuador, is subject to a lot of pressure and could well pull the trigger on a scheme to have him, released to the clutches of the U.S. government.
The very fact that the Trump administration, which was supposedly put into office because of Russia and Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, is going after Assange. It just belies the idea that this was some partisan move by Assange to help Trump get in, and that it was Russia that was behind it as well. Why are they going after him then? If they should be kissing his feet right now, if it was Assange that put the Trump administration in power. So we know that that's nonsense because they're looking long game too, the long term. The CIA is terrified, and I think particularly Vault 7. The release of Vault 7 is really, I think, incensed the CIA, and that's what led, I think, to this outrageous remarks by Pompeo, calling him a hostile non-state intelligence service. So they need to get him. They need to stop WikiLeaks because they can't operate in a world where they can't have the secrecy that they've always depended on. That they cannot present themselves to the public in this way that they are defending democracy, that they're spreading democracy around the world, that they're defending the entire American people, the intelligence agencies, rather than just a class, a very, very, the ruling class of the United States. That's who's being protected by the intelligence agencies. They can't get away with that anymore if WikiLeaks continues to unveil what they're doing to the public. Isn't that right?
Absolutely right. That's the motivation for the CIA to be all out to get Assange. they're very embarrassed, obviously, by the release of these documents, perhaps the most damaging documents yet released that have to do with the CIA. And I guess not perhaps, I think we should say absolutely the most damaging, because they reveal, the way in which the CIA is trying to deceive by its operations, information operations. And I think that this is one of the reasons why, if not the most important reason why, you have such a danger now to Assange in the situation that exists with Ecuador and the Trump administration.
Do you think there's a possibility that it could backfire on the administration in the sense of if they bring him to the US and put him on trial, the attention to Assange and WikiLeaks would grow enormously? I think a lot of people would now start reading maybe more the cables and the things that are still being protected on servers to still available to the public. All these classified documents that have been released over the years are still could be read by researchers, by journalists, by ordinary citizens. If they put them on trial, this is going to be, maybe they don't want that kind of attention put on WikiLeaks. Is there a chance that could backfire on them?
That's a good point. To actually have a trial would be to open things up in a way that would not be welcomed by the CIA, that's for sure, and not welcomed by others who would have potentially more embarrassments because of a trial. I think that's true. That suggests that they're hoping to handle this in a way that wouldn't require it. I'm not enough of a legal expert to be able to go further than that, but I think that must be, the puzzle that they are trying to solve at this moment. How do we do this without having to have our secrets even more openly discussed, studied and discussed in the United States in particular?
Well, that's quite interesting because under the state secrets privilege that they use very often in so-called national security cases, they will go into a judge's chambers who has clearance, show him the evidence, say, well, this is why this suspect is guilty, but we can't tell the jury or the public, so we've got to show it to you, and the judge can come out and declare that person guilty. But in this case, the evidence is already out there. It's already been declassified by the person who stole it and leaked it to WikiLeaks. So it's quite an interesting dilemma there. But even his arrest, even if there's no trial, just arresting him, bringing him across the ocean to the United States would focus enormous attention on WikiLeaks, and that might not be something the government really wants.
Well, I'm unable to say that you're wrong about that. It makes sense that this is a complex case, and they have to weigh pluses and minuses, pros and cons, to very different courses of action. But I have no doubt that the CIA and some others in the U.S., what I would call the permanent war state, would like to see Julian Assange under lock and key in the United States, and may not have even thought through completely what the full implications of that might be.
And would that shut down WikiLeaks, even if they had him under lock and key?
Well, hopefully not. But I think that it possibly could give a shot at the arm to WikiLeaks, could bring in more support. Absolutely.
So obviously they want to try to make an example of him, but if WikiLeaks continues, they have not solved their problem, have they? They still are not going to be able to operate in the same shadows that they have been before WikiLeaks.
You mean that there would be more interest? Yes, absolutely.
Well, I mean, they want to shut down WikiLeaks, I think, more than just get this individual, Julian Assange, in prison, because WikiLeaks is the problem. And if it continues without him, they haven't really solved their problem, have they?
Well, I mean, I'm not enough of a legal beagle to know whether it's really even potentially possible for them to actually shut it down legally or not. I would have.
It's 14 hours.
2 o'clock.
Sorry, did you hear that? my computer's telling me on the hour what the time is.
Well, my computer did as well, but you didn't hear mine. Well, maybe that was mine. But that also tells us that should be moving on to our next guest. Let's see if we see our schedule. Okay, Graham Elberg's coming back in, and he's going to interview Joe Booth. So, Graham, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Well, thank you, Gareth, and thank you, Graham, and I'm out of here as well. Bye-bye.
Great to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
See ya.